The introduction of legalized recreational marijuana in Massachusetts has been clouded by mounting concerns about the dangers of vaping. Those health problems recently triggered a moratorium on vaping products for nicotine that was lifted yesterday, but questions remain about how consumer protection should be targeted and how this affects the sale of marijuana. To tell us about that impact is a cannabis industry consultant and past spokesperson for the legalization campaign, Jim Borghesani. Thank you very much for being with us, Jim.
Thank you, Chris.
And we have, I guess, one more breaking development here about vaping. I guess the state has lifted the ban as well on cannabis.
The Cannabis Control Commission today lifted conditionally the moratorium on vaping products in the cannabis sphere. They didn't do it across the board, but they had some conditions that are on it. But basically, any items that are manufactured after today can be sold. And I think the items that are listed or manufactured before today are still in quarantine and have to be tested with a test that assures that they contain no vitamin E acetate. I think that's my understanding of it. I read it quickly just before I came on.
I know there's broad health consensus that nicotine is harmful and that vaping is harmful, but how much of that applies to cannabis? Well,
cannabis doesn't contain nicotine. I think that the problem that we've seen, to my knowledge, in the whole the whole vaping, nicotine vaping world, if you will, is the addictive quality. So many young people are getting addicted to it because it does contain nicotine, which is a highly addictive ingredient, and the flavors. The state recently determined through the new law that flavored nicotine vape products cannot be sold. I think with the idea of trying to reduce use among children and college age kids. Apparently vaping is very popular at the college level and high school level. With cannabis, it's different. They're vaping in order to use a product, an intoxicating, if you will, product of their choice. Some of the users are medical patients who are using it to address various ailments they may have. Some are users who use, cannabis just like a social drinker might ingest alcohol. What it is, it's just a different method of ingestion. It may work in a place where smoking is not allowed. That gives the user the ability to, ingest their substance of choice in a way that doesn't break any regulations that may be in place where they live.
Well, there have been at least reports of serious health problems with vaping that involve the active ingredient in cannabis,
Yes.
THC. Is this something that's coming out of the legitimate market or just from the illicit market?
Well, from what, the information I've seen, what the CDC, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, what they have found is that it's an additive in the illicit products. In other words, additives that is in products that were sold on the illicit market. And that additive specifically that they've isolated to this point is an additive called vitamin E acetate, which is a thickening agent. And again, that has not been detected, to my knowledge, in any legally manufactured products that have been tested, but it has been detected in illicit products. And that they've found, at least to the best of their knowledge so far, is the ingredient that's been causing these terrible lung problems, including fatalities, quite a few of them nationally. So the idea is they wanted to isolate any products with vitamin E acetate, and those they've concluded, to date have been pretty much on the illicit market. The problem with a ban is that you're preventing people from buying products that are legally tested, don't contain vitamin E acetate, and you're sort of pushing that market toward illicit products that may actually be causing the very health problems that are so concerning.
Well, I know nowadays it's different from 40 or 50 years ago when people were smoking reefers, but if you've got a vaporizer of THC, what about the concentrations? I mean, is there some danger that those concentrations might be so high that you could have some other problems too?
Well, I haven't heard about the concentrations from THC affecting anybody. What I've heard is that it's the ingredients and the illicit market instruments, the vaping instruments themselves, which are doing the damage. Cannabis is more powerful than it was, 40 years ago, just because of growing methods and various other improvements in the cultivation. But I think most people just use less. I mean, it's sort of like you can go into a package store and get wine that might be 6%, 8% alcohol, or you can get Scotch or bourbon that's 80%. You're not going to drink the same amounts. You're going to modulate your drinking in order to match the substance that you're ingesting. I think the same thing happens with cannabis users. They're aware that the product they may be using is more powerful, and they adjust their intake accordingly.
Well, the temporary ban in Massachusetts on vaping products, it was very enlightening because it put something on the radar screen for a lot of people. But I guess what you also must have seen was people dodging that ban. What did you learn from that?
Well, they went to the illicit market, or they went to other states. We saw a huge number of consumers going up to Maine, up to New Hampshire to get vaping products, both tobacco and cannabis. And we were losing, the people weren't, many people just didn't stop using. They just went where the product is. That's what always happens with prohibition. We found that with cannabis prohibition in the first place. It didn't really prohibit anything. All it did was create a market utterly dominated by illicit, dealers who didn't check IDs, didn't pay taxes. Depending on your perspective on cannabis, you may be, not yours in particular, but you may not like the fact that, there are users, but there always have been, because it's a desirable product among many people in the population. They're going to use it. Prohibition never stopped anybody from using it. It just created a vast market of basically, unregulated dealers selling untested products. I think legalization has done a great deal to address the problems that exist with that sort of structure.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with cannabis industry consultant Jim Borghesani. Jim, as you probably aware, here in Boston, we had to put a fix on the legalization scenario because it seemed that not enough of the benefits of that were getting to the communities most affected by the war on drugs, especially the black community. What do you think of the ordinance passed by the city recently?
I think it's a big improvement over what existed before. One of the problems in Boston is that we don't have a cannabis store opened yet. Boston is the largest city in New England, largest city in Massachusetts, voted 2-1 in favor of legalization. And as you and I sit here today, we don't have a single store that's open for adult use cannabis yet in Boston. That's unacceptable. One of the reasons why is because of the slow permitting process. The new process that's in place is going to be much more transparent. It's going to be a board created by some appointees of the mayor, some appointees of the city council, and there's going to be criteria that applicants must meet, including some of the things that you just alluded to: diversity in hiring, equity, returns, support from the neighborhood. So I think you're going to see a much more healthy process in the speed of licensing and the give back to community that everybody in the industry would like to see. And by the way, I would like to see some of the equity requirements, some of the diversity requirements, the workforce requirements. I would like to see that spread to every business that opens in Boston. Why should it be just a cannabis facility that should have a certain number of, or a certain makeup of workforce that frankly is an excellent thing? Why shouldn't that be applied to a CVS that opens, or any other business? I hope that the cannabis industry, being a brand new industry, can actually help transform other industries, and some of the same requirements that are imposed on cannabis can and should be imposed on other industries. But overall, I think the thing that you just mentioned, the reform passed by the city council, is a big step forward for Boston.
One thing that I certainly wasn't prepared for, and maybe other people as well, was a certain amount of opacity about who controls the retail end of legal marijuana, because a lot of us thought of these sort of separate entities, and it turns out there might be a bigger entity that behind multiple retailers. Do you think the city ordinance helps cut through that in any way?
Yes, I do. Yeah, and I think that the Cannabis Control Commission has in place their permitting process, I think, help assures that the people who are actually applying for the license are actually the people who are applying for the license. They may have some equity, but that equity has to be listed for the Cannabis Control Commission. In other words, investors, anything beyond even up to 9.9%, it has to be listed who your investors are. And plus, there's a license limit in Massachusetts. Nobody can control more than 3 retail licenses, so you're not going to see a CVS-style domination of the industry. And the Boston Globe several months ago did a fairly large story on some companies that may be trying to get around that 3 license rule through board control of other license holders. But I think the Cannabis Control Commission is doing a very good job at looking, at what ownership is, how many licenses they may own, just to make sure that everybody adheres to that 3 license limit.
Well, because cannabis is still illegal federally, there's a big advantage for companies or individuals with lots of cash. Do you see any hope of getting around that in some way to make things more equitable?
I do. I think there's already a bill up on Capitol Hill that's access to banking that would give cannabis entrepreneurs the same ability to go to a regular bank and get a loan, a capital loan, that any other business enjoys. That's one of the problems, is that smaller players simply don't have access to the equity needed to get into this business. And that's when you get some of the bigger multi-state corporations that can identify a property, keep it on their books for 2 years while they go through the permitting process, pay a holding fee to the landlord. A lot of smaller operators simply can't do that. They don't have the operating capital to do that. So I hope that maybe in 2020 we see Congress pass an access to banking law that gives this industry the financial footing that it needs and that every other industry enjoys.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Chris.
Jim Borghesani, cannabis industry consultant.